Let's talk about thread tracing and tailor's tacks. First, I want to show you some threads. This is a cotton basting thread. It's pure cotton with short fibers so it breaks easily. The blue and the red threads are also for basting, and they are very short fibers of cotton and also break easily. This is a very fine silk thread. It's used on sheers and silks. And of course, I have the chalk, two different kinds, needles, scissors and ruler, and pens. So this is a piece of wool. I've marked the length grain and now the wrong side. I'm going to take this half scale pattern. This is from a corset piece, and it doesn't have any seam allowance. It's called net because it has no seam allowance. I'm going to put a little mark where the cross and the length grains are. Pin the edges together so that it doesn't shift. And now chalk in the grain lines. This is what I will do when I make a jacket or a coat out of wool, because I want to mark the wrong side of the fabric with the grain lines and baste through it so that when I open the fabric, I can see the grain lines on the face side, the right side of the fabric. I'm going to trace the entire pattern piece. And now thread trace the length and width grains. You want to use a double thread but not put a knot in it. And you're going to make deep loops. The loops probably, if you stretch them out, would be about 3 inches long, approximately. And my stitches are not too far apart. They're about 1/2 inch apart. It depends. If I'm making a very tight circle or curve, I would make the stitches much closer together. But for marking the grain lines, this is ample. The length grain, Now I will chalk in the seam allowance. One of the wonderful qualities of working net without seam allowance is that when your client loses or gains weight, you can adjust the pattern by adding to it and adding to the seam allowance, whereas if the pattern already had seam allowance, it would just be a lot more work. And now I'm thread tracing around the seam. Taking the pins out. Look at the other side. Isn't that lovely? Now you can see the grain lines and the seam line. Now carefully cut it out. Peel it apart and clip the threads. Now we have mirror images with all the markings I need to sew this together correctly. The next thing I would like to show you is a half-scale pattern. This is a bodice front with a French dart and seam allowance. The cross grain line is already marked and the pattern is set on the fold of the fabric. The length grain is basted down the fold. Before I start the basting process, I want to be sure that you understand how I laid out the grain lines. The fabric was blocked, the length and grain lines were basted down, and then matched. The fold is of course down the length grain, and then I put straight pins matching the cross grain. After I'm sure the grain lines are perfect, then I put the pattern down on top of the fabric. I also try to make sure those straight pins are out of the line of the scissors so that I don't damage the blades. So now with the same long loops, I'm going to trace around all of the seam allowances. With the blue thread, I'm making a tailor's tack. I take a tiny, tiny stitch in and out, 1 or 2 threads. And you could end it with 1 stitch or you can do 2 stitches. On this one, I'm going to do 2 stitches. Marking the notches in blue. This way it's easy to distinguish which is the notch and which is the thread tracing around the seam allowance. So for the notches, I'm just making a little loop that I will cut. The armhole notch, the underarm seam notch at the side of the garment, the side seam at the waist, and the French dart. Removing the straight pins, and now I'm going to cut the garment out. Now, clip the loops so that you can carefully pull the pattern piece away from the fabric. carefully anchoring the threads as I peel the paper away. And carefully opening the fabric as I clip the threads, just like the previous piece that I demonstrated. And now you can see how beautifully it's marked on the right side of the fabric. The darts tips are marked and all the seam lines. And one last piece I would like to show you. This is the center front piece of a full-size vest. I have marked the grain line in white, the length grain. The buttons are marked in pink, the buttonholes are in yellow. The notches are in white and blue. And on the face side, you can see exactly where the buttonholes are and how long they are. You can be very creative with thread tracing and tailor's tacks. I'll be working a lot with these throughout the courses.